Hello and welcome to another episode of the ADHD Goals Podcast. I have a very fascinating guest for you today. Her name is Danielle Jata Hall, and she is the author of I'm Not Upside Down, I'm Downside Up, and also Black Rainbow. But also Danielle she has worked in education, has supported many children with SEND, and has run a support group for other parents. She's a public speaker, PDA advocate, and online campaigner. With the support of their MP, Danielle succeeded in tabling an early day motion to get the PDA profile more recognised. And Danielle is also a joint researcher on parent blame, and her findings have been published nationally. And she's also received the Educating Education SEND BAPS Award in 2021. So thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you today, Danielle?
I'm doing okay. Thank you very much. It's really nice. It's a pleasure to be here, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So looking at what I've read about you, you have a very fascinating story to tell. And so I wonder if you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and we start with your own personal experience with ADHD, and in your case, autism and ADHD. So if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah. So I am autistic and ADHD as well. There's possibly a PDA profile in me, but that's been diagnosed as such, but that's sort of been on the radar and was picked up by the clinicians. I've actually only been recently diagnosed this year, 43, so quite old to actually get a diagnosis, because I suppose I would have been quite heavily able to mask my neurodivergence, I guess. I came to this because my children, all three, came out at different points of where they become struggling in sort of with their challenges in life, and then it became on my radar that something was more to explore, and then that's how we can find out about them being neurodivergent. Two of them are potentially ADHD. Which then led to me to start kind of asking those questions about myself, because things started to make sense, and I went through that process. So, like on a personal note, I think it was clear that I was ADHD quite early on. I know that I felt very misunderstood as a child. So even though I was quite academic, I was able to focus in class and stuff like that. So it wasn't particularly that I had massive struggles. But what I did have was struggling with my peers and regulating my emotions. And I find this really embarrassing to admit to people, but I used to feel like I was continuously fighting with everybody, every child on the estate, anyone that I would find that I'd be in conflict with. That's how I struggled through. And I was always sort of known in the family that as I'd always be bringing trouble to the door, and quite misunderstood. And when I had my diagnosis earlier this year, the clinician had said, you learned very early on that it was unsafe to be you. And I think that's quite key. And I think probably a lot of other people recognise that feeling. However that presents in us, we realise that we kind of have to start hiding. And that's what I did. By secondary school, I just learned to go under the radar. I learned to control my red mist. I learned how to just function, really, and to not stand out. There were a few times that those situations did arise with peers when I lost control. But because I was so quiet and academic, people wouldn't expect anything of me. There was one time that a head teacher then excluded the other child, even though I'd kind of reacted to something. But because it was so unusual for me, they kind of instantly went to my defence. So I kind of managed through. But I think afterwards, as an adult, I think that's always been quite tricky, trying to manage work situations, getting overwhelmed as an adult, trying to manage all of my task load. It really has become quite prevalent. The ADHD side now, as I'm getting older, I'm trying to manage with adulting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of a snapshot about why I've kind of come to my own journey of needing to find out if that neurodivergence was there, because it was just always this sort of unknowing. Once I kind of discovered it through my children, I kind of thought, I just needed to know. I don't know if you've ever felt that feeling, but you just need to know, am I making it up? Am I imagining this? Or is there something else there? And it started to
Yeah, the word that stuck out to me the most whilst you were explaining that was the word misunderstood. I think for me personally, I always really strive to be understood, but I also find it quite difficult to maybe explain myself because, quite in quite a lot of situations where I might be talking with somebody, it's the first time that I've been able to process what I feel about a subject or how I feel about something because it's so difficult to process that information on your own because all the
Mhm.
thoughts are going around your head. And it's only
Yeah,
until they come out and you've got to put them in order for somebody
yeah,
that you need a bit of time to sort of let them come out and then go, "Oh, do I think that?" But you're quite conscious of the fact the other person is going, "Oh, you've just said that now. That must be what you feel." And you're like, "I don't know."
so
And
busy, isn't it, in your brain trying to work out, and I think we just need extra time to be able to just get through things in a way, how not just communication with other people, but even like waiting our turn and trying to express, and also I find that I could become so fixated on subjects I want to talk about, and then that's really hard to then have that to and fro conversation, and also I want to talk deep about things. I find it really hard just making the small chat with people. Like I find that really, oh, I've got
yeah,
to find it. And I think then I just use stock phrases of where I'm just asking questions repeatedly and just letting them speak because it just saves me having to think too much. And
yeah. I mean, I get very self-conscious of that. I mean, there was times in my younger days, probably in my 20s, that I didn't think about that, and I would just go in deep. If somebody told, sort of gave you a little snippet of something that maybe was a little bit challenging, I'd just go, right, okay. And people would be thinking, this is not appropriate to talk about at a party. And I'm like, yeah, but no, it's so interesting. Or you find yourself, they might be talking about something and you want to show them that you are interested in that topic and therefore talk all about you and your experience with it.
yeah,
And then it's like, oh, you're not really listening to what I've said. And you'd be like, but I'm trying to show you I'm interested. And when you become aware of that later on, you then sort of become self-conscious of it and then find yourself trying to prevent that from happening because you don't think it's socially acceptable. And then, I mean, that can lead to other things like withdrawal and, isolation from social situations and as well.
yeah, definitely. You kind of avoid, don't you? It's easier to avoid those situations with that knowledge, and yeah, it's tricky. And I do find, and that's where I feel the PDA profile probably fits into me because, and that's where with the diagnosis, I know that the two clinicians actually halted the assessment when they got to a certain phrase when it became, and then they kind of went off to discuss. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what have I done wrong? What have I said? And then they came back and they said, it was just something that you kind of started to say that actually unraveled where we thought the borderline of perhaps that you were autistic and ADHD. But then the PDA side is actually sort of like this overlay over the top, which actually masks all of it so that we kind of couldn't see it and we couldn't kind of distinguish some of this. And it's really complicated to see. And I think that's an added layer of PDA that lots of us become very misunderstood. I know children get misunderstood in school because people think on the surface we're so sociable and able to hold those conversations because we learn to mirror everything. And I think
Mhm.
that it kind of lacks that ability to then see the vulnerability under us and how we can be very naive and how we can kind of fall into situations quite worryingly, really.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um, you've mentioned the PDA, and I think probably, I mean, you've also highlighted the fact that can be quite a challenge for children at school because I think that's possibly one of the sort of this symptoms, the right word, but it can be one of the things that causes the most challenges at school with the teachers in terms of keeping them on board to support that child. So why can you explain a little bit about how you found that challenges for yourself and maybe also your children as well?
For me, as a child, it came about where had this strong sense of injustice. And that was so strong in me that it meant that I had continuous conflict and I had to have this kind of leveling of playing field. And that's a real trait that you see within the PDA profile. And that becomes quite frustrating within school. So, I mean, I can remember a scenario which we laugh about now, one of my best friends, but we both got to an argument over the rules of she was trying to write in her book and carry on at the end when the teacher had said to stop. And I yanked her book and said, I told her a few times to follow the rules because I had to follow the rules. There's the autistic side in me that telling her and also an assumed hierarchy of I was more important than the rest of the children. So I kind of took control and said, you've got to stop. And she wasn't listening to me because she wanted to finish her word. And I yanked her book and it scribbled her work. So she went and scribbled on mine. And the next minute we had a huge, fisticuff fight.
Yeah.
And we both got pulled into the corner. And how we responded to that it kind of explains the PDA, because she knew she was in trouble. So she quickly complied to what the teacher wanted in front of the class. We were sat away, kind of ashamed in front of everyone. And she kind of accepted that and was pulled back out. Whereas I continuously became the clown at the front of the class because I did not like that I'd been told and I'd been shamed, and my sense of injustice that I felt that I'd been wronged, and I continued on with that. And then it was added weight because I couldn't understand the fact that she'd been pulled away and, been let go, and I was still continuously blamed. So you can see then the behaviour starts to escalate because the child's frustrated, and what people don't see is what they're really feeling inside. So that's a personal example of how that played out. But I think that if you can imagine that kind of scenario within a school, there's so many different reasons. And like I could think of examples of my daughter when she was told to go and line up in the class, and they told the kids to do a boys' line and a girls' line. But she hadn't processed all of that. She joined the end of the boys' line and she got shouted at for not following that instruction. And then her behaviour completely escalated, and to the point that she got excluded. So if you actually backtracked all of that, how it was handled, it was, obviously it was misunderstood because she hadn't processed the instructions, and therefore she wasn't being defiant, just choosing that she could go and do what she wanted to do. She was trying to follow that. So yeah, that's kind of how that could look. I think what often happens and I can give you different examples as well because I've got a younger child who's also PDA, but she presents very differently. So she forms her response. So she describes it in her brain, like her brain shouting no, and she automatically says yes. And that's very difficult for people to then comprehend when you're saying to teachers, they'd see her on the playground saying yes to children, running around, following them. And in her brain, she's screaming no, she doesn't want to do it, but it's an automatic response where she's following demands that she can't actually cope with. So it's really complex to get people to understand what people are actually feeling inside and what that response system might look like. See, in comparison, the older child who was much more explosive with her behaviour, so they knew how she felt because she'd kind of react in that way. I asked her, one time she kind of drew a picture for me, and she did like a little stick drawing of a big head, chopped off the part where the brain was and sliced it into two, and it had a yes and a no either side. And she said to me, it's like I've got a yes and a no at like arguing inside my head all times. So when people tell her things that she wants to do, like go and use the toilet, things that just very everyday tasks, her brain's saying yes and her brain saying no, and the yes and no where she's kind of wanting to do something but can't, and that can't but won't is part of that very misunderstood side, because what people see on the surface seems like a child choosing to not do it or complying, but when they're complying for so long and they're masking what they're feeling, then they come home and have that real kind of Coke bottle effect of having that explosion afterwards. So it's avoidance before. So that's a bit of a nutshell of how that could present and how it can be very misunderstood, because as somebody who's observing, the child seems on the surface to be very sociable, to be very capable, and to be in control of what their actions are. And so we go into like a reward and punishment system, which only makes it worse because it's quite futile if you think punishing something that someone can't control. And that's where this side of the disability is very misunderstood.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think, I think it's just very incredible that they were actually able to explain what they felt internally, with that drawing. It's quite insightful. And, I don't imagine all children could be that articulate in explaining that, but I suppose that's quite revealing. Or it only really makes sense if you have any understanding of what PDA is in it. So it's just seem like a journey of, trying to find out what the child is feeling, but also pairing that with what potentially is happening.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, you've touched upon it actually, because the professionals at the time, for my eldest, when she was about 5 or 6, they would be adamant, well, we work with PDA children and you can't teach emotional intelligence to her. You can't get through, basically. It was like a void of, she's almost choosing to do this. And then other people would be saying, we would expect, the kind of intelligence that she's got is so above her age. Like, we'd expect a 15-year-old to be able to come up with the kind of critical thinking about her own self that she would at 6 years old. But then this is where it's at odds with each other, because she would actually have the emotional reactions of, say, a toddler. And even now, she's 13, she still can react like her reactions, will be sort of, she won't be able to manage any of her emotions to a situation, and you'd see her regress to almost like a toddler age. But then and then you've got her physical age, and then you've got her ability to actually think outside of the box and actually have such incredible, intuitive, intelligent conversations with herself that are way beyond her years, well into like an adult. So it's really it's kind of, it doesn't match, if you know what I mean. That's why they get called a spiky profile. And that's why it really confounds professionals, because they've got no idea. Or some people do if they've got a real experience with PDA. But if they don't, there's a lot of assumptions and bias that get made. And that's where we go into sort of blaming, child blame, parent blame, which therefore creates far more trauma on top of it, or autistic burnout, etc. So
yeah, just hearing you describe that now, I can think of somebody who close to me who's a child that's going through something very similar, and I'm thinking, this is probably struggling very much with teachers at school, and although sort of ADHD has been mentioned and trying to get a diagnosis, that there seems to be an understanding, oh well, provisions, accommodations need to be made, but the accommodations themselves are delivered in a very un-ADHD friendly way, and I think PDA can really play into the reactions that happen to that, because the school feel like that they're making accommodations, and the child is like, no, I'm still, reacting to a lot of things that the way that you're treating me. And then I think, the sort of the relationship between them, it's gone on for so long that the bridges have been burnt, and it's just,
trust will be broken, really. That's what happens, because if the child's not being listened to or understood, it just repeatedly creates more and more challenges and difficulties as it kind of feels as like a downward trajectory, really, and something really worrying, actually. And if those tools and platforms are put into place at the beginning, you have such a different outcome.
Yeah.
And I know that kind of firsthand of how difficult those outcomes come if the child misunderstood, it can lead to so many difficult things. I don't know if I can say trigger warning just before anyone is listening to this, but my eldest has had many breakdowns. She's been admitted to hospital for her mental health and actually gone into crisis multiple times. And she actively tried to harm herself when she was 5, nearly 6 years old. That's when the first time she got admitted to hospital. And if I tell you that statistic, it seems like it's surreal, like I'm talking about somebody else's life. But that's what happened, because from the age of being 4 into school, she was blamed and excluded on a daily basis, to the point that she had nothing left in her self-esteem. And we have repeatedly gone to those kind of places later on. And I'm not saying that everyone's situation would be as extreme as that, or as early as that, but we do often see quite a lot of individuals who are neurodivergent that get hit kind of burnout much more later on, like maybe late teens or early adulthood. But if they've kind of held themselves from the lack of understanding and support aids, it does sort of affect you.
Ew. I mean,
So
I mean, just hear you say that. I mean, just anecdotally, I assume that that sort of it comes a lot later, maybe as they're approaching puberty, that
yeah,
those feelings about sort of self-harm sort of arise. But to hear that happening at 5 and 6 years old, that's incredible. I mean, you've touched upon sort of a lot of these challenges that you have faced yourself and with your children. And I wonder if you can that go on to explain sort of what that journey has been like in terms of how you arrived at doing all these things that you do now based on that journey through all those experiences.
I will. And I will try to be very specific on some of those points because the journey is so extreme and so many different factors. It could go off into completely different
Yeah.
areas. But in a nutshell, from my eldest entering school, I was in a position where I had a child that was really struggling. As a parent, I was getting blamed. I was still married at the time, and we were just heading to crisis to that point where I've just described what happened.
And when you say blamed, what was the reason for blaming you?
Because the behaviour that she presented with seemed very controlled. So it seemed as if it must be a parenting problem. They felt that I perhaps wasn't strict enough with boundaries or using rewards and consequences, using sort of general things that the blame lay on me as a parent for the fact that she was not complying. And once that opinion's there, it's very difficult to change that. And at that point, any of my own background of the fact that I'd worked in schools, that I'd kind of, I was educated, all of that was completely pushed aside. Nobody cared about that. It was just an assumption. And at that
Mm.
point, our marriage broke down really because we were under so much stress. And she went in and out of different placements over the years, excluded continuously to the point we got a specialist placement. And they changed because it was an independent school, they changed their rules and they excluded her too. And they just excluded not just her, but they removed all the other children that had PDA and decided not to take PDA children because it was too complex and too difficult for their school. So we went back to basics of continuously, repeatedly trying to find a school for a child and every school just said, no, we don't take PDA, no. And that's quite tricky as a situation. So from very early on, when I had this child who was at age 4 that was in school and was really struggling, I started writing about our situation and the blog kind of arose. And that's why I started writing PDA parenting, because I'd found this thing called PDA and everyone around me, and particularly in my local area, it wasn't something that would be diagnosed. And everybody didn't really know what it was, or if they did, they just said, you won't get that here. So I went out on a mission to really change that and start getting us understood. So hence the reason I started writing. I worked with my MP to get that tabled in. I got the award for writing and stuff, and I paired up with another writer to write the children's book. So I was kind of doing little bits and pieces to really make that difference of trying to share awareness. And also for the fact that it was also therapy for me, because trying to connect and meeting other people started to branch out, because at home, I was stuck in a situation where I had a child that wasn't in school. I couldn't work longer and I was a full-time carer. So I needed something to be able to focus my skills and actually feel like I'm doing something positive. So that's where I started with that. In the meantime, the 2 younger children started to break down after COVID time. Once the rules started changing, going back to school, the coping strategies that they'd learned in school would have been kind of broken because they'd been out of it for so long, and their presentations started to change. And this is where we came back into parent blame again. Because I started asking for help for the younger 2, it was assumed that there must be something wrong with me again. So the professionals around me worked together to try and find and prove this feeling that possibly I was fabricating or inducing illnesses. So the other phrase is called FII, F-I-I. And once they had me down as FII, they worked very hard to push that narrative with as many people that they could. They tried to find evidence. So much so that they got my elder child on her own and tried to find ways of getting her to say things that were very difficult. And we're basically being trapped, really. I had child protection dangled over me, and I was begging for just help to say, just try and give us some assessments for the younger children and just see if there's any help there. What I forget to say is that actually we did have a couple of good professionals that had been on our case from very early on and had worked with me, knew what I was doing in the background, and they kept that going. So there was one defining moment I was asked to speak at a conference, and I donated my fee to the PDA Society. I was really up there, and I was speaking to 350 delegates and doing our story, helping share this awareness. And at the same time, I came out of that conference feeling like I'd really positive. I'd done a high. And on my journey back, I found out that a meeting had been held place and about my children, and I wasn't included in it, and basically then tried to shape that narrative. But those good professionals that were there made a note that they were unhappy that I hadn't been included or informed in any of this, and started documenting it. And so with the help of those sort of good professionals that were aware and tuning in, they all started putting assessments in, and then we came out with multiple diagnoses later. But school had already broken down for both of those two younger ones, and it was very hard to get them back again. So now all three children are on these packages of support. So they've got education other than at school, otherwise known as EOTUS, because also school wouldn't take them either because they were PDA and there was lots of complexity within their presentations. And we don't really have schools in the area that can actually make that work. So the children now go out and do different stuff. And going back to when I was accused of fee, I started to unpick some of that, and I pushed back the community.
Can I just, whilst you were talking, that I had looked at what fee MEEC stands for.
Yeah.
Could you just explain that to the listeners in case nobody's come across it before?
Yeah. So fabricated or induced illness is what it stands for. And it is an assumption that the parent is making up the illnesses or the disabilities in the children. Unfortunately, this is a go-to route that quite a lot of professionals go down because there's a lack of understanding on what neurodivergence can look like. So quite often they therefore think that the parents creating it up, making it up and stuff, and then kind of try to accumulate evidence to see if that safeguarding concern's there. Once people think that, it's very difficult to override it. So for us, once I was under that and I was being threatened with child protection, the community behind me raised £1,000 and I paid that on legal fees to actually stand up, and they kind of proved that there was absolutely no evidence of that at all. It was the lack of support and understanding that was happening. And then that's when we kind of started to change that narrative. But we come back and forwards to it. I even faced it again recently for another year, and we went back through the same thing. And then I've had another letter of apology from my health services and stuff. But what happened is once they went through the fee thing, I could not write online. I could not do anything. I was being documented. Every part of my social media was being observed and it was being used. So I had to shut down, and really they basically shut my voice down, really. One thing that is quite key to think as well is that because I did have social media platforms where I was writing, I was influencing other parents to know their rights, to self-advocate and etc. Part of the use of fee could possibly have been because of that. I may well have been targeted because of that reason as well. So I had to really shut down everything. And that's when I started writing the novel Black Rainbow. And I started writing about a character whose voice was quashed, basically, and who needed to feel like she needed to rediscover things and start a journey there, really. So I think I was able to put my frustrations and everything down because having everything completely closed and being observed at all times, it was very difficult to actually feel like I had any freedom. So it kind of all my energy channeled into Black Rainbow so that I could kind of make a positive change. And the book's definitely not a negative, it doesn't even touch upon the deep, dark areas that my own journey has gone on. But it's there to kind of almost be like a tool to actually support others, I think. I wanted to make it a positive, really, from a bad experience.
I think the challenging one, because I hadn't heard of fee before, but to hear it explained in such a way where it's being used as a weapon in this way, it just makes me think of my own personal journey in terms of trying to figure things out. And I see, I've heard a lot of people talk about it, in their own journey, is trying to, because you do feel within yourself is like, is this right? Do I have this? Am I making it up? Is anybody going to believe me? And in your own journey of sort of acceptance and figuring things out, you do think, well, is this my fault or that? And especially also, I think when you're looking at it as a parent for a child as well, you do question, is this my fault? And so to have gone and struggled through that, to then to have that used against you, it's must be really a hard thing to go through emotionally.
It was traumatic. It was beyond any level. Can you imagine every day being absolutely petrified that they're going to take your children away, and any wrong move, anything that I said would be taken against me? So I've seen the reports that have been written about me, which is like, mum's anxious, mum's making it up, mum's the source of anxiety. Mum wants a diagnosis. They thought that I could be fraudulent or whatever, that I was actually emotionally harming my children, and not knowing that it was almost like there was this dark shadow over the back of me, continuously chasing me. I'd lay awake at night dreaming and imagining myself and thinking about an escape plan, and thinking, what if I run out of another, try to escape to another country or something, and took my children with me. At least I'd keep them safe. At least they'd stay with me. What could I do? It was just horrendous. Everything when they're actually tapping into you and following every single part of your life, it's really scary. There was one point a social worker got my daughter aside and started trying to ask her to do things that she shouldn't have been asked to do. But my daughter sensed the agenda. She knew something was up, the way that the lady kept insisting to get her on her own. So she took the phone with her and actually hit record. So there's a black video of just the recording of this conversation where she is being led and forced by a social worker who should be there to save her. And what's really difficult is once you're in it and you can't get out of it. Like, the authorities, they're in your life, they're part of it. I couldn't pull away, because if I pulled away, that was another red flag. I had no escape out of it. It was just a living nightmare day to day. I can't put it any easier than that, really.
So where are you now in that journey? Has there been any improvements, a light at the end of the tunnel? What's happening currently?
I think my voice is being heard now, really, again. I've kind of freed away from any of those allegations, and they've officially written apologies to accept all of their wrongdoings and that it won't happen again. So things could hopefully be improved. The children are now starting to access kind of provision that's suitable with the EOTAS plans. So that's a big difference. Because up until this point, I've always been with the children, still running their education, and everything's kind of fallen on me. So now, actually, for snippets of time, like now, to even record this podcast with you, they're actually out with mentors and actually accessing some of the community in some form of education. So that's a real positive, because that was a light we never really saw happening. I've managed to now succeed with the book, and the Black Rainbow book actually has taken on a bit of a huge response. The reviews on it have been amazing, and it's just led to me doing loads of different conferences and webinars and stuff. And now everyone's coming to me asking for my input on things, and the people that I'm working with now as professionals around us ask me first, what do you think? And that's a huge difference, rather than, they're like, oh, you're the expert in this. What can we do? And that's not that I'm necessarily the expert. We're all experts. The child's the expert. We should all be working together. the moment that they ignored my voice, they were on a downward spiral into misunderstanding for us as a family, which just makes things worse. So, yeah, so things are a lot more positive now, I think. It's just now I can just try and do as much as I can now to just share the word. And I just really want to prevent more children from being misunderstood and keep families together,
Yeah.
like in
Yeah.
my developing journeys.
What you just said then in terms of, people coming to you now, and I feel this about other things as well in terms of it's not necessarily about having an X or having a protocol that is rigid that says this is what all children with PDA should have or all children with ADHD should have. It's about acknowledging that these are some recommendations, but it needs to be a conversation between the school, the teachers, and the parent and the child in order to understand what are the right accommodations for that individual child. Because
Yeah.
it's quite easy to say, okay, well, we've got this framework now, and we're just going to put them to that. And it's almost trying to squeeze them from one box into another box that doesn't necessarily fit. And they feel that they've done what they need to do. And then if the child doesn't, improve or whatever, then it's their fault.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's where this is the misunderstanding with PDA, because no two children are the same. And also it the strategies look so different to what they might do for something else. So like if you had ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder, you'd kind of be very rigid with your framework of strategies using rewards and punishments, and the child would start to respond to that. But if you put those kind of frameworks in for a child with PDA, you're actually making them more traumatized because they can't help the fact that their response system happens the way that it does. So it's almost like changing how that would be. And this is where we say the school situations, one of our biggest challenges is ever finding a school that's suitable, because schools can work when they use a set of strategies that they know how to use, using timers or social strategies or now and next boards, all of those kind of things that you might use for other neurodivergent presentations, because the child's got the routine and they know what's coming. Whereas this is completely different. We need flexibility. We need to follow those interests. We need like ability to go with the impulsivity that the child might feel. So it's the fact that you've got to do it completely different means that it's very hard for people to even consider touching, really. That no 2 days are the same. What worked yesterday for one individual for PDA, the next day you'll try to use that again, it won't work. And that's really hard to get your head around.
I was thinking of this earlier when you were talking about, the schools were just saying, no, we don't take PDA children. And I've got a couple of questions regarding this. The first one is, I'm assuming, this is probably not the best label to it, but you were looking at a regular, state school to try and get them in, and they were saying no. So my question is, what would have been the alternative? Are there, in quotation marks, special schools that would deal with these sorts of challenges? Or was there just literally like, oh, we don't really know too much about PDA, so therefore we don't want it on our doorstep? So would there have been another option?
Yeah, and the thing is as well, it's a good question really, because the PDA, there's no really one suitable school that will sit well for anyone really. So mainstream can work if the right adjustments are made and the right ethos in the school is going to be appropriate. That could work, but it's going to take a lot of adjustments, and it is a whole school approach. So sometimes that can work. Sometimes a specialist school, so quite often you'll go into more of a behavioural school, so SEMH, which is social and emotional mental health school. And they're the kind of schools that will be a state school. It terms as a specialist school, but that's where children with PDA often fall into. But if you're mixing PDA with children that have got complex trauma or like behavioural needs, that makes it far worse, because often they might copy the behaviour. Also, you won't get the fact that they're quite traumatised or scared inside. So that kind of but and I say that there are some SEMH schools that are doing really well across the country, depending on how well they approach it, So
Mm.
that can work. Then, so we've done a range of those kind of things. Then the specialist school that I did say about earlier that changed their criteria of who they took on, because what they found is they wanted children that were going to be neatly falling into a box that might be academic, that might kind of get a few GCSEs at the end and stuff. And they kind of thought that was going to be where the school would head. Once they got the complexity of PDA, and that the moment they tried to put a step forward, the child would take a step back, it meant that those strategies, it was too fixed and they couldn't do it. So that's where they started to change their criteria. But there are some specialist schools around the country that do work, depending on how well they're approached. And actually, when my daughter started that school under a different head leadership, it really worked. And they were really flexible and amazing and very therapeutic. And the way they did it, it was working. So I do think it can possibly work, because you've got to rebuild the trust as well. Then there's a couple of other options. Some children might be in an alternative provision. So that could look in all different kind of ways, maybe flexi schooling where you're mixing between school and home. A lot of children with PDA really do benefit from being home educated, because self-directed learning allows them to really excel in lots of areas.
Well, I was gonna ask about this, and I'm seem to be mentioning this a couple of times on the last few episodes. So it's obviously something that is my mind is going to a lot, hyperfixating on at the moment. But Montessori, because my kids went to a Montessori, and I'm very aware of this, and it's something that personally I think needs to change. Is that Montessori isn't really considered, though, a viable education system in the UK. Yeah, it's okay to just have a Montessori nursery, because it's I don't know why, but but as soon as they go into primary school, it has to be it has to be we have to do things properly now. But that properly now is the box within which a lot of children struggle, even neurodivergent, in fitting into that box. Whereas, with a Montessori school, that self-directed learning can allow them the freedom and also the less tension. But it's also about providing them with a level of trust as well, to say, okay, do what you need to do, and you will be able to see what they can do, rather than constantly pushing against them to say, you need to be more like this, which they can't. And that's where I think a lot of the trust can break down. And I think a lot of people are afraid to trust children to say, show us what you can do, because they just want them to be well behaved, and they assume that they're not going to want to learn, and they are going to want to misbehave because they've labeled them as misbehaving. So I don't know. I haven't really asked the question, but does Montessori ever feature in a viable way of being, a system that can help children? And what are the conversations with people who can make decisions on these sorts of things? Because I'm fascinated to know.
Yeah, I don't know the particular answer to that. It's not my particularly specialist field, but I hear a lot from other parents when they've been in Montessori that it actually really does help, because that style of play, being a curious learner. In answer to your question about that, like once that leaves and we go into the education system and it's so prescriptive, that's when we really start to struggle with a lot of children. And if you lean upon other educational systems, I think, is it Finland and other ones, where they've kind of allowed the children to go much later to school, like age 7 or 8. They don't even start learning to read or write until that age, but they catch up. And everything's very much about all learners being on the move when you're learning, and self-directed learning. Lots of those schools actually have an ability to be so inclusive that they work for everybody. And I think if we had that kind of style like Montessori all the way through, because what we do is we put demands on the child so early, like they've got to learn phonics, they've got to learn, and sometimes their brains are not actually ready to learn, or they're not even in that flow of interest yet. So because my eldest one was excluded so early on, and she couldn't really read or write, and I was continuously trying to push the whole phonics side things at home. I try and find little ways to get it in, just to help her start to learn to read. So I was doing as much as I could in the background. it just wasn't working. She'd reject it all the time. There was just no interest. And then she was about 8 or 9, and she suddenly started reading overnight and writing over. And it was all through Minecraft and different gaming things that she could do, or searching on Google. She would find the information that she wanted to do, whatever she hyper fixated in, whether that could even be the Titanic subject. She would become so extreme in it. And now, like, she's 13, she's never really had any formal education. She's everything she's done is self-taught. And she'll point out something to me about grammar. And I think, how does she know that? Like, so interested. And if we allow children to play and follow their interests, they will have so many good skills, critical thinking skills, all of the stuff, which if we did that, the Montessori style all the way through and allow children to follow that, it would be amazing. We would have so many different ways of exploring and learning through the world, but we don't.
Yeah. And
Much.
this is the thing, and this is what's struck a chord with me, is that there's only, and this might be different since my kids went there, but there's only one school that I know of that went from the nursery up until, what you would call as sort of the sixth form age. There's only one in this country that does it, and it's not free. You have to pay to go there. So, and what annoys me is that there's no awareness of this alternative way of education. I think I experienced this myself. My children's mother, she is from Europe, and there's a lot of countries that don't send their kids to school until 7 because they understand that the brain sometimes isn't ready to take on all that information. So I wasn't aware of that until we are prescribed such a narrow system here in this country that you think, oh, well, this is the only way to do education. And you're not aware of different things that other countries do and have success with. And I think it is fascinating to learn about these things, but then you just ask yourself the question, well, why aren't we actually offering this as an alternative and for free? As I think it's such an important thing to give people more choice, but we need to find a way of making it not exclusively for people who are able to afford an alternative route.
Could you imagine? I mean, and it would actually benefit our country, though, because we would have so many free thinking people that they would actually, all of their skills would really be, supported. And actually, it would benefit our system. We'll have, people that can actually contribute and achieve. Whereas lots of those ones fall off the radar because they have found school so challenging that they kind of fall off the wagon. And, it's different in my own house because my children are supported. They've got a parent who's been able to guide them, but there's a lot of children that don't have that. And, what are their life aspirations because they haven't managed through school, and they kind of almost, I remember I worked with some boys that were about 14, and one of them said to me really heartbreakingly once, he's like, what's the point, miss? What's the point? We're just a load of, can I swear?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
We're just a load of dumbass kids that nobody wants. And how sad is that? That's what he felt. And do you know what? There was a whole head of drama that refused to teach this particular cohort of kids because they said their behaviour's so bad, nobody wanted to be with them. So they put them a stand-in teacher that was just paid just to come in and do that without any experience, no qualifications in it. And I was a teaching assistant that would be put alongside that particular group. But between us, we actually liked and cared about these kids and have them outside doing drama on the field. We'd raid the department, get loads of masks worked out. And do you know what? Some of them, that one boy that said that, who's had lots of brothers and dads that were in prison, and there was lots of different social dynamics there. He was totally missed and cheering in all the time. And do you know what? He got these masks on and he was incredible. His whole body melted to these masks, and he actually was hilarious. He was inventive. He was so good. And continuously would be like, do you know what? You're actually amazing. You're so good at this. And he actually just felt heard and listened to. And if that approach could be used through schools continuously, it doesn't matter what we take them out and what we do, but we actually take an interest in what they're doing and what they are good at, what kind of life would they have? There'd be so many as our country, it would benefit us, wouldn't it? That we could support them. And that's where it comes so early on, that intervention of supporting children. And I wish that Montessori thing was accessible for everyone, really. I wish the system was different, because it's only when you're in it and you find that you can't, like, I managed through school, so it wasn't really a big deal for me. But for my children, they've not managed. And it's through them that I see it in a whole new light of, actually, this is a 2-tier system here. If you're able to, you can get through. And if you're not, it kind of casts a whole trajectory downwards. And I think that's terrible, really. In a society that we've got, we're ahead with things. So why can't we adjust our education system? Sorry, I'm on rant.
No, I like it. But I think what you said just before, in terms of, what would we be like if we had a country of creative thinkers? I think we're seeing now with the internet, and specifically with AI as well, in terms of how easy it is to access information, that, there's less need for teaching children how to remember facts and figures, or, because the need is not there. But to teach them how to think creatively and problem solve is a skill that they're actually going to require, and that we are going to require, because even the challenge of how do we make an education system that works for all, that's a problem and a challenge that needs to be solved creatively. And so, I agree. I'm trying to stop going on a rant myself. But I think just with the time that we've got left, what's next? What are you currently working on, or what's in the pipeline?
No, well, I've gone off on a new tangent now. My ADHD brain's thinking, wouldn't it be good to be the education minister and implement?
Yeah.
No, back to reality.
Well, why not?
Yeah. At the moment, I think I'm really going to try and get my book out there. The reason I really if I had a dream of what I could do, is I would like this book taken and adapted for screen, because a part of my background is also, my master's was in around screen and stuff like that, and around film and stuff. And that would be my dream, really, if I could get that adapted from on something like, I don't know, even BBC or Netflix or Amazon or something. Because what I would like to do with the characters in this book is really take them on a journey, because this book, I would say, is more of a mild introduction into what our lives can be. But I really want to shine a light on, actually, what's it really like to be a disabled family, trying to navigate the society that we live in, and how can we change that? But also, it's not all doom and gloom. There's lots of comedy in it and stuff. Wouldn't it be good to actually see ourselves represented on screen in a story that would be, it's written by us for us, if you know what I mean? That would be my that's the long-term dream. I would really like that to happen. But in the meantime, I'm just happy that it's doing well. And I'm going to I think now that I've kind of got through all my ADHD procrastination trying to do this, because I found it really tricky doing some of the promotion side and actually following through the task, because once I started with the book, I found it really hard to just focus on the demand of actually starting it and keep going with it and keep re-editing and stuff. But once that was done, and where I'm at now is I really want to start a new book, but I'm finding it hard to actually focus on the demands. A lot of procrastination. But I think now that I've kind of had some experience in this, I think stories, fictionalizing characters is the way forward, because people can see it in a different way now. And I've focused on ADHD a lot within this book, and I'd really like to explore that further as well. So yeah, they're my...
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's what it is to be human, is we are human because we tell stories, and it's what helps us understand and allows us to then work with each other with empathy. So, well, that just leaves us to recommend to the listeners that they must go out and read your book, Black Rainbow. You can get that on your website and on Amazon.
Yeah.
So your website is pdaparenting.com.
Yeah. And Amazon is probably the easiest way, because you can get it does qualify on Prime as well. So it's quite quick to get that way. So and it's on a Kindle format and paperback.
Yeah.
I would like to start raising the funds to actually make it an audio version as well, because I know that a lot of listeners, are not with reading. So
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Danielle, for coming on the show. And I wish you all the best with trying to make all those things happen in the future. I think it's fascinating what you're doing. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, there we have it. Thank you so much for listening this far. If you want to hear more episodes, then please subscribe on YouTube or whatever podcast platform you use. It really helps to spread the word. So if you know anyone this episode could help, then please share it with your friends. If you want to follow me on social media, I am on Instagram at ADHD_goals, and you can find me on Facebook too. If you want to get in touch with the show, then you can email me at hello@adhdgoals.co. And finally, if you're struggling to manage your ADHD and you would like me to be your coach, then please head over to my website and get in touch. Until next time, bye for now.